College football nerds here after a little bit of a hiatus, and we've got a lot to talk about. We're probably going to talk a lot in one session and break some of it up. Happy to see y'all back with us. I've got my nerd Josh going with me. Got a little May college football discussion. We're going to talk a little bit of everything, but we're going to start out with the state of college football. Want to announce something we're probably going to do later on in the summer when NCAA College Football 25 comes out. We're going to try to have a little bit of gaming and talking college football with some other maybe faces around the college football YouTube and Twitter sphere. So keep an eye out for that. Josh, let's just kind of talk a little bit about the state of college football and where we're at right now. We're going to force ourselves, because we're known as, I think at this point, we're both known as Grim Reapers in the college football discussion world, but we're going to try to stay positive for a little bit. We're going to bring some of that negative back to you, but to start off, let's go in a positive direction with the state of college football, specifically heading into 2025 or 2024. And one of the things that I want you to touch on first is we've long since the start of all this said that 6 playoff teams is the number. We've fought playoff expansion. We'll maybe get into why that's not a great thing a little bit later. But one thing I think is clear, even though you and I probably prefer the BCS era, it was a lot of fun to transition into the playoff era at the beginning. So when we went to 4, I think there's an opportunity, at least in the beginning, for this to be a lot of fun. If nothing else, it's something new. And at the end of the year, there is a little more interest.
To me, the biggest positivity that exists in college football is I think there's been kind of a need to shake things up a little bit. Even us as people that don't necessarily think expansion to 12 or 16 teams is the best idea, would want to argue there's really no doubt that college football has suffered because when you get to bowl season at the end of the year, everybody starts opting out. Even in the regular season, when teams realize they're not going to win their division in the conference, I know this happened a few years ago with LSU, really quickly you can see guys start opting out of the regular season. And I think there's really kind of been a need to address that for years. So I will even admit that bowl expansion is necessary from that regard. And to your point, Daniel, the reality is that when you first have changes like this, it's very exciting. And you've got teams like USC and Oregon on the West Coast in the Pac-12 that, quite frankly, have been thrown into a conference where about half the teams just don't care. And they finally get to go play college football in a conference where teams do care. All the conversations we have about whether West Coast teams are any good because of scheduling isolation, I won't say that gets thrown out. In fact, we'll probably talk about that on the negative end. That problem exists even worse now in a different way. But for those teams, you actually get to see them stack up against the Big Ten. You get to see Texas and Oklahoma and what it looks like with them in the SEC. And it's really exciting. It's almost, I would almost argue for the next 3 years, it's like you're getting an elongated bowl schedule week to week because you're going to have these new matchups on a regular basis. And when the playoff first expanded in 2014, those ratings were the best ratings the postseason ever. And really, we had a very continual decline year to year, really up till this year for whatever reason, various reasons, Michigan's popularity being a big one. The ratings were actually very good this past year. But up to that point, it had been a very continual decline. And I think that points to the fact that people like something new and original. I think it's going to be true over the next few years that we're going to see a lot more interest due to the novelty of everything, due to the fact that a lot of teams are suddenly more relevant on a national stage, due to the fact that I think there's going to feel like the playoffs matter more. And I think in the short term, before we get to the idea of whether or not this playoff structure is going to work or be competitive, before we get to the idea of whether NIL long-term is going to be sustainable, right now I don't think the players and the schools are at such a point where NIL is doing serious damage to the on-field product and everything else is more exciting. So I think this is actually going to be, for the next, let's say, 2 to 4 years, maybe some of the most fun periods of college football that we're ever going to have. And I think the CEOs and the heads of the conferences that made this happen know that. And that's why this got pushed through, because at least for 2 to 4 years, I think this could be kind of some of the most fun college football we've ever had.
I agree with all of that. I don't love super conferences for what it's going to do in terms of being able to glean who had a good schedule and who didn't, who had a good record and who didn't. But I do think that some of the matchups are going to be great. I don't love what it does for weakening the out of conference schedules that are going to, there's no incentive to schedule tough out of conference games anymore. Because, we've got super conferences now, but a lot of those new matchups would have been effectively out of conference games in the past. So from that standpoint, we're still going to see a lot of good football, and we're going to see a lot of interesting football. I have concerns that, in the NFL, you have a lot of great matchups. Obviously, there's tremendous parity, but nobody cares if you lose a game or two in the regular season. There's no impact there. We're going to lose some of that, but I do think we're going to gain some of the interest at the end of the year that we didn't have before. Now, I don't agree with the people that were saying that in the past. There's a couple people on Twitter that are like, oh, well, it's better now because now if you lose your first game of the year, you don't completely lose interest. That's a gross exaggeration of how it's always been, because I think we did the numbers, and I think there was only like 3 CFP championship games that didn't feature a team with at least one loss. So that's a little ridiculous. But overall, I do think the interest is going to be there throughout the whole season. I think we'll see long-term having an impact on the regular season. But right now, because everything's so new, it's great. I want you to amplify one of the biggest positives and kind of sit in on it for a minute, and that is the opt-out situation. That's clearly going to get better. We've talked about this already. But talk about that kind of in detail about, how that's going to be a lot better.
I think the biggest thing is going to be postseason playoff football should have the entire team that's healthy playing all at the same time. Frankly, it's been a massive disappointment that get to the end of every year and you have situations like last year with Georgia versus Florida State, where Florida State fans may be irritated with us because we said, look, the committee made the right decision. Florida State wasn't the same team without Travis. It's true. Again, you take the last 2 team games they played offensively. If you extrapolated that and called that their entire season in terms of game averages, they would have been 130th in the country in offense. They were that bad at the end of the year. Their defense was phenomenal. And I was excited to see that defense play Georgia. And they could have played a really grinding game against Georgia that would have at least given me an idea of what it looked like for them to be in the playoff. But because of the reality of college football today, we don't really have a clue what Florida State was. And we will argue till the end of time between whether they should have been in the playoff and had a chance to win, or whether they had no chance to win and shouldn't have been, whether they should have been and it deserved it. I want to see those teams play in the postseason. I enjoyed the BCS era in part because those teams, even if they weren't motivated, the players still played. And you at least came out of the game with some idea of where they maybe should or shouldn't have been from a slotting perspective. And we lost that over the last 5 to 10 years in college football. We just lost it. A few years ago, Oklahoma played Florida. It was 2020. And the entire starting receiving core, a couple linemen, and basically 2/3 of the defense all opted out. And Oklahoma, I think that was the year with Ramondre Stevenson, just destroyed them the entire game. But again, it was like, how good was this Florida team that almost beat Alabama, almost made the playoff? We don't have a clue. So I'm really excited about that personally. I'm excited about not only in the regular season seeing guys stayed in, but I'm excited to see those games go away. I do think the number of opt-outs outside the playoff is only going to go up as a result of this, but there's going to be enough games in the playoff to sort of satisfy. In some ways, it's a better thing with having more games in the playoff because you have to start to concede. Other bowl games are going to see just mass opt-outs, I think, at this point because they're going to feel even less relevant. And the other thing I'll say is with NIL in the current state of college football, I think it does incentivize kids a little more to be more, I won't say more engaged, but they really do have to play throughout the season. And NIL maybe offsets some things we saw a few years ago where it was starting to be that guys opted out of the regular season because they were going to go to the NFL. And NIL and the reality of it, look, NIL is endorsement rights. We say this all the time legally. That is starting to go away. And NIL, I'm even seeing lawmakers refer to it as revenue sharing. At some point, people need to switch the term because NIL has a very specific meaning, and you can't just make it mean whatever you want it to mean. it is a very commonly used term in the legal space, partly the legal space I deal with.
Well, that
and
was
I
the
deal with
Trojan
NIL.
horse, right? Like that was the palatable Trojan horse to get pay for play.
Right. And we're not there. But if you accept that we're not there and it is pay for play, the point is you're still paying the kids to play. And I think that will keep kids playing the whole season. And if you're on a team that goes 5-7, it does give you an incentive to at least show up. And the last few years, we've had a number of instances where teams absolutely quit and players dropped out. And the thing is, it not only ruins their season, but just like, what was it, 2020, 2021 LSU? I'm trying to remember the time frame. Had a bunch of guys opt out. And it started, it kind of effectively ruined games for everybody they played because, now you play this team that's a shell of their former self. You beat them in a tough game and nobody cares or nobody watches. And it's not really a real game anymore. And so, COVID in its own way, that COVID season had a lot of that problem, right? A lot of teams didn't really carry through the entire year. And it ruins it for everybody at the end of the season. So that's, to me, a really big positive of the current changes is I do feel like we're going to actually see football matter in that regard through the end of the year. Even if the problem is, I think it's going to feel positive for the first few years. And then over time, I think people are going to start to realize how much losses don't matter and that collective anxiety we have that makes the sport so fun is going to start to diminish a little bit.
We're always right. But a lot of times people will take the very early stages of a thing that takes time and they say, see, there's no problem, so you were wrong. And then ultimately it's just wait. Just wait.